would say that influenced me, to look beyond the textbooks because, I had encountered this idea of extreme human antiquity in the Vedic teachings of ancient India, and also in many other traditions as well. The Egyptian pharaoh list, the Sumerian king list, the Chinese emperor list. They list personalities, rulers, kings, emperors who existed in very, very ancient times, going much further back in time than current historians and archaeologists would expect. So when I first started looking into the textbooks, I didn't see any evidence for extreme human antiquity. I only saw the evidence that conformed to the current paradigms, the current dominant ideas in the academic and scientific world. But, well, let me look beyond the textbooks. Let me see if there's anything there. And when I started doing that, when I started looking into what I call the primary scientific literature, the original reports by archaeologists, geologists, others digging into the earth, I found many reports of scientists, archaeologists, and others discovering human bones, human artifacts, human footprints that go very far back in time, in some cases, many millions of years.
Welcome to the Consciousness of the Way. I am your humble servant and Sifu, Taoist Master Sun Qing, and I have an incredible guest here today, an anticipated moment for myself, and I'm very grateful that he's gracing us with his presence on the podcast today. Michael Cremo, how are you, my friend? He is a human researcher to the origins of all things and an author on the ancient understanding of where we came from. I'm very grateful to have you on the podcast today, my friend.
Great to be here with you and all your viewers and listeners.
And I mean, for anyone that doesn't know who your name is, which I think would be very strange, but let's just say we don't have someone, could you give someone just an abbreviated version of your incredible journey up to this point?
Well, I began a journey on a spiritual path in this lifetime that brought me to India, and I became a disciple of a guru from India and a practitioner of bhakti yoga. And part of that spiritual practice is using whatever talents or abilities that you have for a higher purpose. In other words, make your spirituality something practical, real, with impact and influence in this world. So I've always had a talent for writing and, to a limited extent, speaking. And I applied that to looking at different scientific topics from the perspective of the Vedic teachings of ancient India. So among those accounts from those ancient wisdom traditions is the idea that humans like us have been around on this planet for vastly longer periods of time than modern science allows. So I began investigating the history of archaeology. And to my surprise, there's quite a bit of evidence, if you look beyond the textbooks into the original scientific reports, showing that, in fact, there's a lot of evidence that's consistent with these accounts of extreme human antiquity that we find in the Vedic literature and the literature of other ancient wisdom traditions. So I put together a book called Forbidden Archaeology, which is probably the book I'm best known for. And that leads to other questions, like, if we've been around for a long time, what's the significance of that? And the significance is, well, we need new explanations of who we are and how we got here. And I think those new explanations have to involve consciousness. In other words, we're not simply machines made of molecules. There's something beyond that. So that's the topic of my book, Human Devolution.
Wow. Wow. It's interesting because you just sense that there's something greater. I perform a lot of ancient practices from my lineages within Taoism, and they come in many different forms. And there's a level of ascension that comes from the evolution of the Taoist practitioner, i.e., priest. And we have all these internal alchemy practices that lead us to a higher state of consciousness. And within that, there are different subsections of that very, what I consider sensory perception. So, when you channel information, you kind of get a different state of awareness. Now, what does that really mean? I believe everyone's doing it every day. What drove you to the desire or need to look further beyond the text? Was there a sense? Was there an intuition coming from your practices, your spiritual awakening? How did you enter into that consciously?
Well, it may have something to do with the way I grew up. My father was a military intelligence officer, so that meant a few things as I was growing up. One thing it meant is moving around a lot. Because military people, they don't stay in one place. So I lived in a lot of different places in the United States, Hawaii, Europe, other places. And that exposed me to the idea that there are different cultures with different ways of looking at the world. In other words, the American way that I initially had experience of isn't the only way of looking at the world. And also being connected with people involved in the intelligence services gave me exposure to the idea that there is such a thing as confidential knowledge, that there are certain things going on in the world that many people are not aware of, but which are factual nevertheless. They may not be mentioned in the newspapers or the evening news or whatever, but they're factual nevertheless. So I would say that influenced me, to look beyond the textbooks, because I had encountered this idea of extreme human antiquity in the Vedic teachings of ancient India, and also in many other traditions as well. The Egyptian pharaoh list, the Sumerian king list, the Chinese emperor list. They list personalities, rulers, kings, emperors who existed in very, very ancient times, going much further back in time than current historians and archaeologists would expect. So when I first started looking into the textbooks, I didn't see any evidence for extreme human antiquity. I only saw the evidence that conformed to the current paradigms, the current dominant ideas in the academic and scientific world. But because of this experience that I had growing up, I decided, well, let me look beyond the textbooks. Let me see if there's anything there. And when I started doing that, when I started looking into what I call the primary scientific literature, the original reports by archaeologists, geologists, others digging into the earth, I found many reports of scientists, archaeologists, and others discovering human bones, human artifacts, human footprints that go very far back in time, in some cases, many millions of years. And I began to think, well, if this evidence is there in the original scientific reports, why isn't it in the textbooks? So that led me to the idea that there's a process of knowledge filtration that goes on in the scientific world and in other fields of human endeavor as well. And basically, the way that it works is that evidence that conforms to the dominant ideas, the current paradigms, passes through this intellectual filter very easily, which means you'll hear a lot about it. But if there's evidence that is just as good qualitatively, but which happens to predict a dominant paradigm, it tends to be set aside, forgotten, ignored, dismissed on some superficial basis. So I think we all engage in knowledge filtering to some extent. We don't believe everything that comes to our attention through the social media or any other type of media or method of communication. But what sometimes happens is people employ a double standard in the way they filter knowledge. For something that conforms to their expectations, they're very lenient. Oh, yeah, there may be this flaw or that flaw, but basically it's okay. Whereas if there's something that radically contradicts their mindset, even if it has hardly any fault, they'll find some way to dismiss it. So I think the solution is people have to be upfront and open about what filters they're applying to the knowledge. And people just have to judge, are they applying the same standard to the different categories of evidence and knowledge and information that come to them? You know, for example, say you have a building inspector, and for his friend who's got a building going up, he overlooks things. Okay, that's not really up to code, but it's all right. But then for the person he doesn't like, even everything's perfect according to code, find some way, find some obscure way to dismiss it. And that's what I'm really concerned about, the unfair or unequal application or misapplication of standards for filtering knowledge.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think it's happening before our very eyes within the digital platform we call the interweb. And neutrality is an interesting word. And what's going on really is we're erasing things as if they never happened. And that to me is very problematic. And there should be some way to measure what is determined to be absolute truth, or what is the truth, because we're at this point where this is the truth and that's it. Don't even talk to me about anything else. I'm not interested. And I mean, that would also be in reference to the evolution of man. That's really on the table right now as a question mark as to the origins of, DNA and how far back that actually goes, and into what form we're really presenting ourselves as a human expression. What does that mean, and how long has that been operating in the annals of time itself? That the landscape of that history is now in question. I believe, and enough people are throwing that question mark out, and there is definitely evidence that would lead you to believe there's something more. And that's why I find your research so powerful in finding that. So what was the next stage that you went to when you came to this realization? What was the first thing that you observed and went to discover what the truth was for you?
Well, now, of course, I can recall, even since I was a child, a very young child, 2 or 3 years old, I was always interested in fairness, justice. I didn't like being exploited or misled or told a story that wasn't true in order to get me to do something. I was always interested in the truth. That's one value that I always had. And I was always interested, even as a child, in justice. Uh, that people, including myself, be treated fairly. So I've always had those core values, you could say, in my life ever since I can remember. And I think we all have to examine what are our core values, uh, what are our things that are absolutely essential to our personal lives, the lives of people we care about, and in general, life in this world. So I've always been concerned with those things. So when I began looking into this particular aspect of reality, in other words, the where do we come from? Who are we really? I was, in looking at the textbooks, I noticed something. It was in 1859 that Charles Darwin published his book, The Origin of Species, which I think he's got some very good insights, but also some things that I don't agree with. And one of them was the idea that we're basically machines made of matter that have evolved from more simple types of material beings by a process of evolution by natural selection. I think there is a kind of evolution, but not exactly the type that he talked about. It's the evolution of consciousness, the evolution of the soul as it passes through different kinds of bodies in the cycle of samsara, of birth and death. In other words, I accept the idea of reincarnation. But I noticed that after Darwin published The Origin of Species, and people began speaking about the missing link, something connecting ancient apes, which were considered to be the biological ancestors of modern humans. They were talking about a missing link, something intermediate between the ancient apes and the modern human form. And I would have thought they would have been immediately looking for that. But I saw in the textbooks from the 19th century that the first so-called missing link wasn't discovered until the late 1890s. In other words, about 50 years, 40 or 50 years went by with no discoveries of any intermediate being. And I thought that was a bit unusual. So what I began looking into was I got the textbooks and the original scientific reports from that period of time, that gap between the publication of Origins of Species and the discovery of Java Man, an intermediate being, the so-called missing link in 1892. So when I looked into the original scientific reports, I found that scientists were discovering many, many important things, but they weren't intermediates. They were human beings like us, existing millions and millions of years ago. So when the so-called missing link, Java Man, was discovered in 1892 by a Dutch researcher called, his name was Eugene Dubois. He found at a site called Trinil in Java a jawbone, a lower jawbone that looked very ape-like, and a femur or thigh bone that looked a little human-like. And they were found about 50 feet apart in excavation. But he put them together and said, ape-like jaw, human-like thigh bone. It's an ape man. It's a missing link. And that's the intermediate we've been looking for all these years. I've got it. So when this was accepted, we have to keep in mind it was found in a formation about 800,000 years old, so less than 1,000,000 years. So then it became a problem. What are we going to do with all the discoveries that were made in the previous decades that showed that humans like us were existing 5 million, 10 million, 20 million, 50 million years ago? That's when the knowledge filtration process really began. And they decided, okay, we're not going to talk about that evidence anymore. It was kind of cast into oblivion. And after the Java Man discovery became widely accepted in the scientific world, then when anybody discovered any evidence for a human presence that went back before that, they either just dismissed it or they interpreted it in such a way that it fit the paradigm, that it didn't disturb the idea that humans like us had to have come into being after this Java Man discovery, which was less than 1,000,000 years old. So what I've always tried to document is not only the nature of the evidence that, well, here's a bone that is just like that of an anatomically modern human, or here is a footprint that is exactly like that of an anatomically modern human, but is millions of years older than it should be. Or here is an artifact of the kind that archaeologists would normally attribute to human beings like us. But because it was found in a formation millions of years old, they make some excuse. Well, it must have slipped down through some crevice from some higher, more recent level. It really doesn't belong there. Things like that. So I try to document not only the physical aspects of the discovery itself, but the process by which the knowledge filtration process operated in this particular case. And one case like that was the California gold mine discoveries. The 19th century, gold was discovered in the Sierra Nevada mountains in central California. And to get the gold, miners went there and dug tunnels into the sides of mountains like Table Mountain in Tuolumne County in central California. And deep inside the tunnels, the miners found human artifacts, human bones, and formations that modern geologists tell us are about 50 million years old. Now, these discoveries were announced to the scientific world by Dr. J.D. Whitney, who was the chief government geologist of California. His report was published by Harvard University in the year 1880. But we don't hear about these discoveries anymore today. There was a physical anthropologist, William Holmes, who worked at the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C. He said, he was a contemporary of Whitney's. He wrote, if Dr. Whitney had understood the theory of evolution as we understand it today, he wouldn't have published that study, even despite the imposing array of evidence which he had to support it. In other words, to translate that into simpler English, if the facts didn't go along with the dominant theory, they couldn't be true. They had to be set aside, cast into oblivion, and that's what happened. But some of the artifacts from the California gold mines are still in the Museum of Anthropology at the University of California at Berkeley. They're not displayed to the public, but I got permission from the directors of the museum to study and photograph them. So they are still there, but they've been set aside by this process of knowledge filtration.
Wow. My goodness, my mind is blown right now. So you're not just like insinuating, just from data and information that you can correlate within accessible, deeper research, that just the origins of human life as we know it in a similar meat sack could date back to a million years that you can see so far.
Yeah, or even much further. I would say my intuition is
Yes.
that humans have been around since the beginning,
Mhm.
because on the basis of my exposure to the knowledge of ancient wisdom traditions, especially the Vedic tradition, would conclude that the universe has a purpose. And its purpose is to allow conscious, intelligent, personal beings to come to an understanding of their real nature and their real origin and where they should be. And that type of knowledge is attainable in the human form of life. Like we're having this discussion, you and I and your listeners and viewers, we're in bodies. We have a developed consciousness and intelligence where we can understand and appreciate these ideas. I would rather doubt that we have some dogs or cats or insects in our audience who are participating on the level that we're participating. So I would say if that is the purpose of the universe and it was manifested with that purpose, the vehicle that allows a person to attain that purpose, in other words, the human bodily vehicle, should have been available right from the beginning, because that's the purpose of the place. Just like if we decide to make a space station, send a space station into outer space, we don't just hope that somehow or other the chemicals inside that vehicle will combine together and spontaneously form some first simple organism that will gradually evolve into astronauts. Now, we make the space station because we've got astronauts that are ready to use it for its intended purpose. Conduct their scientific research or voyage here or there or whatever. So I would say the human form of life, the human bodily vehicle, which is the vehicle that can allow a conscious self to achieve this purpose, should always have been available.
Wow. So you're suggesting that from your own understanding within your research and then your intuition that you believe the form that we're speaking of, that we're resonating from physicality wise, has been present the whole time.
Yeah, and even deeper than this is the idea that this isn't the only universe that's ever existed. There are millions of universes, and they're constantly being recycled, coming into being, persisting for a while, contracting, going into an unmanifest state, being remanifest again. And I would say in all of those universes and all of those times and places, the human form has been available. It's the plan for it has always been there, you could say, in the super mind, the intelligence, the consciousness that's behind this whole manifestation. Of course, everyone has to come to their own conclusions about these things, but you're asking what I've concluded or take as factual. So,
Wow.
there it is.
Well, no, I mean, it's mind blowing because, I mean, from my own intuition, as you mentioned, reference yours, I channeled my source information in a new age word. Someone might call it the halls of, I think it's a lamente, something like that, or Akashic records. There's a reference point to high levels of consciousness, and it transmutes into this reality, however you see it. I use my own teachers, Lao-Tzu specifically, direct source information, and he's been sharing with me, including the Yellow Emperor, the Jade Emperor, all the immortals within Taoist belief system, and they've been sharing information with me on the very nature of what you speak of for over 30 years. And when I've referred to the realization that, Lao-Tzu was only, in physical form, maybe 3,000-4,000 years ago, is a fast, in my opinion, from direct source information from him. Now, this is my opinion, this is my perspective, this is my realization, but I bring forth, access to information that is mind-boggling. I just finished transcribing a 2024 version of the Tao Te Ching with Lao-Tzu giving me the information, and it's now coming out in English, Mandarin, and Pinyin. And, the person that was my Mandarin teacher that was translating it was in tears. And she's like, this is unbelievable, because the way that this is written brings me to my childhood, when we briefly touched on that within China, Taoism, the Tao Te Ching briefly. It's kind of like a fleeting moment. And it makes me so emotional just reading these very words. And it's so powerful. It's direct source stuff. And we call it within Taoism the magical register. And each verse is an incantation that you discover that has 81 different levels to it. So, I mean, you and I are resonating with this very notion, just me sharing this information. It has a resonance for you. There's a validation of your own realization going, this is just another peak moment that just validates my very journey, because someone else has experienced something that is visceral, that it's on a level that goes beyond the word smithing that most people have. It's like this visceral knowing, the feeling of it. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Actually, in my book, Human Devolution, I have a cross-cultural study of cosmologies of different peoples, widely spread through time and space, including ancient Chinese wisdom traditions. And it's amazing when you look at these different cosmologies from different world cultures, different places, different times in history, from the Americas, Africa, Asia, Europe, Australia, the Pacific, and so on. They tend to have similar insights. And one wonders about that. Is it that I think it's because they're accessing from their particular cultural standpoint the same reality. It's as if people were looking at a mountain from the east, south, from the west, from the north. The descriptions are going to be slightly different because they're looking at things from a particular angle. But it's also going to be obvious that they're looking at the same phenomenon, that underlies their slightly varying perceptions. So I mean, the other hypothesis is, well, the human mind just has a tendency to hallucinate and make up stories in the same way, which I don't find as satisfying as the idea that there's actually something real out there or in here. Inner outer is kind of one of our Western dualities, but that there is existing some ground reality that all of these different wisdom traditions have access to and can give access to. So,
yeah. No, I mean, I agree wholeheartedly, 1,000,000% on what you're saying, and there is this dismissal, discovering this stuff and being in, Taoist metaphysics, and using that the foundation of my trainings over the last 30 years, teaching people these internal indigenous practices of cultivation. Most people will start off with potential, what they perceive as being, approached as a psychotic episode. And then you look deeper. These people are like, hang on, I'm seeing things, I'm feeling things. And now today, of course, in 2024, you open Yelp and there's 500, psychics and mediums and channelers and healers and all this kind of stuff. Yet they're not snake oil salesmen the way I would perceive something like that 30 years ago, because I would go out of my way looking for these very charlatans, because I had a deeper nature of understanding in my own training. I did a little vetting processes looking for these type of people, because naturally my instinct is I want to see it. I'm not interested in the wordsmithing. I want to see what it is you're speaking of. If you're going to give me a psychic reading, tell me something that I have not shared with you. Experience an energetic experience that is second to none, a physical manifestation, magic, healing, whatever it is. I have to experience. The experiential moment is the very validation for me. So, I think it goes in line with what you're speaking of, that you can dismiss this stuff. And most people sort of get glimpses, in my opinion, over the years, where they get a taste of something, but they don't really have a system to cultivate it. So I had a vision, or I felt this energy, and then it's lost. And that's where I find a lot of people on my doorstep, because the Taoists do have systems that have worked for thousands of years, being handed down from generation to generation. And it gives you a handle on your reality. You're able to really get a sense of the true nature of things, because once you realize everything is energy, vibration, frequency, and if you hold a resonance, then you can experience it. I mean, it's kind of like what Tesla was alluding to with the energy, frequency, vibration. I mean, in my opinion, from my own journey, that's the only thing you can put a stamp on to validate it, and then it's your individual experience. And how do you come to that conclusion? Because I mention quite often, the Jade Emperor and the Yellow Emperor and Lao Tzu will tell me teachings about stuff that are tens of thousands, 20,000, 30,000 years. And when I reference it on social media, people go, that's a hack. The Tao Te Ching hasn't been around 10,000 years. It's only been around 2,000 years. And, I can give you direct source information from Lao Tzu that would curl hairs on the back of your neck, because you're in the presence of this wisdom that was developed from the very understanding. And his admission to me was he received it from the universe. And that's how he acquired that. He was quite clear that his connection with the universe was how he acquired the very words that are layered within the Tao Te Ching. And then, we have a higher level of ascension, which is an expression of consciousness within Taoism. We call it the three pure ones. And they are the keepers and the creators of the cosmos. And so, I mean, there's just so much to this. It's so exciting. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I agree with you that experiential verification is an important part, not just to, as you say, be wordsmithing. And, you would say, I believe in something. But I think the things that we're talking about are beyond belief. Now, belief may be necessary for some people, that there's a creed that states certain doctrines or truths, and in order to be part of that group, you swear to accept these things. And I would think if that's all there is, then it's not very satisfying. But if, as you point out, there's some way of getting experiential verification of these truths or mysteries or whatever we want to call them, then that is much more satisfying. You don't need anybody to certify that you're, a believer or whatever. You actually experience things. I think like the very fact of consciousness is something that's unexplained by science. And if I apply a particular terminology, like if I say soul, well, people become a little uneasy because I think that's religion. That means belief. You have to believe in something, believe in the soul. But if I put it in terms of consciousness, I'm just, you're conscious, you have your consciousness, I have mine, I'm aware of what's going on in my body and mind, you're aware of what's going on in your body and mind. We're individual, we're conscious, we're persons. Those things are not matters of belief. Those are the most real factual experiences that we have. It's the foundation of our reality, our individuality, our personality, and our consciousness. So it's not a matter of belief. Now, you can go beyond that, beyond experiencing the bare fact of I'm an individual, I'm personal, I'm conscious. You can become similarly aware in an experiential way of different states of consciousness and different contents of consciousness that may be revealed. So many of the ancient wisdom traditions, like for example, the Vedic tradition, have systems of yoga and meditation that are meant to deliver that kind of direct experiential confirmation of truths that may be also listed in different scriptural writings, different texts, but they're not just items, to say, I believe. They're meant to be experienced, as you were putting it.
Yeah. I mean, it's right back to referencing Kundalini as a very popular definition or a word used for an energetic experience. And it's very popular right now for people to say, hey, I had a Kundalini experience. And I don't dismiss anyone's belief system because I dismiss my own. I always use that as a baseline. It's very important. But I will preface Kundalini is a mastered internal alchemy skill that personally in my own journey of 30 years teaching that very stuff and having mastered internal alchemy myself, there's a degree of Kundalini as an energetic awakening, and then Kundalini as a mastery from a yogic perspective where someone's going deep within to working the alchemy and separating electric from magnetic and all these sort of weird things that you can do. And from that, side effects come in the nature. I've only ever come across one or two people that have had Kundalini mastery where they levitate, they stop their heart, they do all these things. And that's fine. That's just a different level of consciousness. The energetic experience is still a validation, yet people sort of get this sort of idea that, oh, touch that, I've done that, I feel energy. And there's so much more. They sort of close themselves off to, I had a Kundalini experience, I'm good. Now I'm awakened to consciousness, the definition of it, whatever that is, which I think is fascinating, because I had a friend of the channel, Tom Campbell. I don't know whether you've heard of him, and he's part of like an out-of-body experience. Used to be a former NASA physicist, and his admission was, I came from my right brain to literally acquire a learning how to operate the left side of my brain. And still to this day, retired NASA physicist, out-of-body experiencer, teacher within the Monroe Institute. I'm not sure you're familiar with that. And he's taught for over 60 years how to help people access this state of awareness. And, he would say that I spent 99% of my life in intuitive sets of knowing, not this thinking. And I refer to it as, if you're thinking, you're not knowing. If you're knowing, you're feeling. And this is sort of like a registered sort of expression that another friend of mine, Hans Wilhelm, would say, if I'm contracting, I'm going to move away from it. If I'm expanding, I'm going to move towards it. And so we have these inner understanding of mechanisms that can help us identify this intuitive stuff from the heart that becomes real to us through our own exploration, rather than just relying on someone feeding us the wordsmithing that tells us the sky is blue. And it's so funny, because I always ask people, it's like one of the first ways to identify with your conscious and unconscious processes is like, you don't even think about your name. It just is. You don't even think about the ground you're standing on, your heart beating, your breath. These are all autonomous processes that can be accessed. And this is where I move back to the Kundalini experience. You can master them yourself if you choose to go down that path. What are your thoughts on that, Michael?
Well, that is all about the mechanism of the vehicle that we're occupying as conscious selves. In Bhakti Yoga, which is the system that I've dedicated myself to, there is an emphasis on, you were talking about emotions, and technically in Bhakti Yoga, they're called rasas. And emotions in their most intense state are usually experienced in connection with a relationship between one conscious individual personal being and another. One of the worst forms of punishment in the world, the most cruel type of punishment, is solitary confinement, where a conscious individual personal self is denied all contact with other conscious personal individual beings. And that is a very painful condition to be in, especially for long periods of time. So one solution to that is to give up individuality and personality and just try to merge into impersonality. But it's the personal individual nature of the self is indestructible ultimately. It's like if somebody can hold their breath underwater for a minute or two, that's fine. But eventually they're going to have to come up for air and breathe, because it's an unnatural state, this impersonality. So there is a science of awakening one's eternal relationship with a individual, personal, conscious source of all existence and all relationships and all of the rasas or emotional tastes connected with those relationships. And for me, that is the ultimate, to discover the actual eternal emotional condition of an experience of love. So that is a goal that I aspire for, and I think ultimately we all aspire for relationship, a satisfying relationship that is in harmony with our tastes for what an ideal relationship should be. So there's a science for developing that. And yeah, that's basically what I see as the ultimate goal. And if that goal is achieved, then it includes everything that comes before that, which is controlling and perhaps manifesting mystic powers and things like that. But that is not the ultimate, in my opinion.
Yeah, no, I would agree with you 1,000,000%. It's some of the subsections or the effects of your high state of consciousness and embodying the true nature of all things, which is being this present moment, the oneness within Taoism. We call it the Wu Ji, between the breath in and the breath out, which is the entry and awareness of the mother of all things, the Tao. And so there's a resonance that comes with that. And that resonance is so palpable. And it just so happens, being in this oneness state, it's this selflessness, this accepting and embodying all things as one. The effect is love. You can it's measurable, it's palpable. And so you know, the as my dear friend Martin, Buddhist monk, would say, he's looking for the dukkha, the distortion, and his distortion would be his emotional content getting in the way of this state. And so he observes, he goes from first person to third person to no person, and observes this expression of what I consider personality, which is the sum of your life experiences. I always remind people, your personality should never be erased. It just becomes a sort of like the side effect of your own journey of consciousness and awareness. Your personality becomes polarized by this state, this resonance, this love. And so the other subsections of your personality, the emotional state that you might have invested in beforehand, as you continue to raise your consciousness, becomes your default, as it should be, your perfection, restoring yourself back to your childlike state, childlike in your nature, accepting everything as is at face value, which sounds sort of like blind faith, but it's not actually. If we resort, that's why you observe gurus, what people consider regressing and going backwards to childlike in their nature. That's because they understand the simplicity of how powerful that is, and that's where we lie in this state of love, oneness. And when we're able to access that, synchronicities take place, perfection, expression of perfection, that is, you know, Buddha, Tao, God, Allah, universe, however you perceive it, you're able to embody that as one, this present moment. What are your thoughts on that?
I think oneness is important, because without oneness, it isn't possible to really love someone. There has to be some basis of commonality of the experience. So oneness has to be there. this takes us a little bit into the weeds of philosophy, but in the Bhakti Yoga system, the philosophy is called Achintya Bheda Abheda Tattva. And Achintya means inconceivable, and Beta means difference, Abheda means oneness or non-difference, and they're simultaneous, inconceivably, simultaneously, one and different at the same time. So you were speaking about God, Allah, Buddha. The name for the Supreme Being in the Bhakti Yoga tradition is Krishna. And Krishna means all attractive. So you were mentioning going to the child state of natural acceptance. Well, the child exists in relation to a parent, mother, father. It's called in the Bhakti Yoga tradition Vatsalya Ras, the taste of being a child or a parent, because it's a relative relationship. It involves being a child means being a child of a mother or father, basically. It's not that one is just a child by oneself. So there's got to be a simultaneous oneness and difference. The simultaneity of oneness allows the possibility for the two personalities involved in the relationship to experience a common pleasure or taste in the relationship. Like, sometimes you see a mother or a father playing with the infant, making it laugh, making it feel different things. And the parent feels something, the child feels something, and they're both aware of it because there's a simultaneous oneness and difference. The oneness allows the common experience. The difference allows there to be exchanges of rasa or pleasure or taste. And basically, according to the Bhakti Yoga system, there are 5 principal rasas. One is neutrality, passive adoration of a beautiful or attractive person. Like somebody may be a fan, a Swiftie or something like that. They don't know Taylor Swift, but they're very worshipful. They adore, they purchase the records, they go to the concerts, they follow the social media. No direct connection. But then the stage beyond that is servitorship, where you can imagine someone becoming the secretary or bodyguard of a famous or attractive personality. And they've got a relationship of employer, employee, master, servant, but it's relishable, it's pleasurable to both parties. Beyond that is the rasa called Sakya rasa, or friendship, where there's an equality, a friendly kind of exchange. Friends don't engage in master-servant relationships or passive adoration relationships. There's a friendly exchange, some equality. One friend will joke with another, criticize them, and the other accepts it, and gives it right back to the person. Then beyond that is the parental relationship that we were just discussing. And then beyond that is the conjugal relationship, which may exist in either married or unmarried form. So there's a basic rasa that every conscious individual personal being has as a part of its nature. And they're not exclusive. One contains, one rasa contains the seed of other rasas. And you could say, well, the conjugal ras is the highest one, the married or unmarried love and beloved. But it contains also parental feelings, friendly feelings, servant feelings, and passive adoration feelings. So there's a whole science of rasas, a whole science of discovering what is one's personal relationship, personal individual relationship on an eternal level with the source of all being. And that source can reciprocate in any of these relationships with an unlimited number of partners, can be the perfect child, be the perfect friend, be the perfect lover, not just for a limited period of time, but forever. So that is kind of what I'm looking for. And I mean, this is kind of a deep conversation that we're having.
I love
This
it.
is not the normal sort of thing I'd be saying in an interview. I'd be talking about stones and bones and things like that. But I regard my research in archaeology as part of my practice of bhakti yoga.
Mhm.
And what I'm really trying to excavate is the buried love in my heart. That's part of my essential being, but I've yet to fully uncover it. So I regard what I do in terms of my writing and speaking and things like that as part of my practice of bhakti yoga, of trying to satisfy a desire of my guru that certain truths be expressed in this world. And yeah, that's part of developing love. Like you were saying about spiritual life or conscious life in general, it's got to be something real on the table experience. You can say, "Oh, I love somebody," but how do you show that love? What are you doing? What are you bringing to the table? What are you bringing to the relationship? It can't just be theoretical, as you say, wordsmithing.
Right, right. I mean, normally I start people off with love as a baseline because most people are still in a state of you know what you know, you don't know what you don't know, meaning that you're operating in a conscious and unconscious processes subject to a duality. So, with that standing, your definition of love is subjected to your experiences. So, love in of itself to someone could be razor blades and bunny rabbits, and to someone else it could be rainbows and unicorns. And then as you ascend in this state of consciousness that we speak of, this oneness, this singular, the conscious collective, that's when all of a sudden you start to form a different, a universal realization of this love source that we speak of, this resonance. But it is subject to where that person is on their own journey at that moment. And as they acquire greater states of consciousness, as I'm categorizing it or referring to, and as you resonate higher, love becomes this universal state that is undeniable, and you become selfless and embodied in that very, realization. And it's you don't have to think You are expressing and feeling that, and that's where, you know, most people within the Tao Te Ching, we refer to, when you act in virtue, you have none, because it's a concepted, sort of constructed perception of how you're supposed to let the world see you, as opposed to, if you're selfless and you are at one with all things, that's not even a question on your mind. There are no questions. You're just being this present moment. You're not thinking, which is where people get caught up in the wordsmithing and the dukkha, the distortion of what things are. And as you ascend, there are no thoughts. It's like Jade Emperor always reminds me, all thoughts of your mind are not yours. Well, then whose are they? Well, it depends on where you're at in your own journey and starting to realize a greater acceptance of this present moment that brings you to that point. And then furthermore, Lao-Tzu will always say, if you have to learn it, you do not know it. If you know it, you don't have to learn it. Your experience and discovery of human origins did not come from you taking information at face value. If that was the case, then you'd be stuck in the same rat in the wheel perception of, you know, troglodyte to human form evolution of man, and we would just end it there with a very dampened, sort of narrow viewpoint of Darwin's theory of all things, which leads to homeostasis, which leads to the very words, where do you get this expression, survival of the fittest? Well, people know it. They don't know where it came from, but it came out of the very words of the mouth of the person we spoke of, Darwin. So his theories of regulating this uncontrollable sort of like human or mankind on planet Earth by using simple things that are still being regulated today, famine, war, viruses. These are the very fundamentals of how people are regulating what they consider a homeostasis on planet Earth, which is still so fundamentally distorted, in my opinion. And that intuition that you're using to drive you to discover more didn't come from accepting, you know, the wordsmithing. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think that's a good way to portray it. I agree with you that there are forces and powers in the world that are making use of different features of, I think, what you called our homeostasis to keep things like that. I think it goes back to the ultimate question of the nature of a conscious being, which is to be unselfish, to not be trying to dominate, control, and exploit others, but to exist in loving harmony with all conscious, intelligent, personal beings, which there are a limited number. And the thing that prevents that is selfishness. It's called technically ahankara, false ego, where instead of being a harmonious cooperator with feelings of love and exchanging feelings of love with all other conscious, intelligent, personal beings and the source of it all, one becomes desirous of controlling and dominating and exploiting for one's own personal interest the other conscious, intelligent beings and the resources that are provided. So, on the level of pure consciousness, such a selfish type of attitude can't coexist. There has to be another place for people, conscious beings, to act out those sorts of desires in competition with each other. And that's where the Darwinian idea of survival of the fittest comes into play. In this world, which is kind of like a virtual reality system for the conscious beings that are in that condition of selfishness. There has to be a place for them, and this is it. But it's a dual purpose universe in that, all right, it gives us the facility to act out individually and collectively our desires. And we can see what the sum total result of that is. It's the world that we live in with all of its conflicts on all levels of human society. And simultaneously, it's also an opportunity for the conscious selves to come to their natural state of being, which is that unselfish state. So the kind of world that we experience is kind of the result of the balance at any particular point in time between those who are progressing towards the idea, I'm a being of pure consciousness, you're a being of pure consciousness, we're all beings of pure consciousness. There's no need to divide ourselves into competing groups on the basis of gender, race, nationality, even religion, and compete with each other for survival, try to establish domination, control over others and the resources of nature. We can satisfy our material needs in the most simple, natural, efficient, and fair way possible while putting most of our energy into developing our consciousness to its original state. So if that number or that percentage of people is increasing, we're going to see progress. If the number of those who are into pursuing their selfish desires individually and collectively, then we're going to see conflict at all levels of human society. We're going to see destruction of the environment. We're going to see all kinds of problems of the type that we're used to hearing about every day. So it's kind of a decision that each of us has to make, what path we're going to put ourselves on.
Yeah. I mean, go ahead. Yeah.
Well, and we have to accept the consequences.
Yeah. I mean, it sort of drilled down to you're being, subject to your reality, but without further notice, understanding this duality that we speak of, and you don't even realize you're being subject to this, unconscious processing and information that's coming in from your peripheral into your unconscious, giving you the idea that, I need to have a belief system in, red or blue, have a political position, have an idea of who is right and who is wrong. And I think that's where we get away from this oneness that you and I are embracing and have an understanding of. And when you get into the weeds of the human experience in of itself, then you start to lose sight of that. I mean, a mastery would be being able to operate in your personality within this 3D and still have the incredible insight and oneness that you can embody and transmit and resonate, so that you're affecting other people to realize that this is present, it's possible, it's potent, it's the truth. It's sort of like you start to discover more that people are being desensitized to these very sensory perceptions that we all have, yet through the framework of history, we've been moved away from that. Just like, as you through your own discoveries, the origins of humans date way beyond the confessed sort of timelines that people are speaking of, as if where we only just turned up, 10,000 years ago, 5,000 years ago, 100,000 years ago, clearly through your own discovery, 1,000,000 years ago. I mean, it reeks of manipulation. And this is kind of like where we get to, are we going to be able to discern or affirm individually, or do we have to listen to the groupthink, the literally what you would call a psyop, because that's what happens. I always remind people, if you're emotional, you're suggestible, coming back to the very nature of what we're speaking of, being able to just be one with all, being selfless, being love. And I mean, you and I understand it for our own experiences, but most people just go, oh, that's just that new age mumbo jumbo stuff. It doesn't, because they don't know, they've never experienced it yet. So instead of the programming that makes them dismiss it, the idea, and exactly as through your own admission, the more people that resonate there, the more there's a realization of that very moment. I know that if I walk in a room, what I transmit fundamentally alters everything around me, whether it's a physical space that I'm aware of, or the land, the street, the town, the city, the country. I transmit that into all things. And, if you look at it from a quantum physics model, that would then lean on the idea of an entanglement. From a Taoist perspective, we've had this access to the universe for hundreds of thousands of years. And it just happens to be part of your experience in this humanness, is discovering these sensory perceptions that you have the ability to in tune with that. And when you're expressing that, it's effective and infective. It affects everything around you, and you embody it. It's just like someone in a bad mood walking into a room, and you just fundamentally know they're in a bad mood. I want to go in the other direction. I don't want to experience whatever it is. They're angry, they're confrontational, they're whatever, but you can sense it. And I think this is sort of like us coming full circle. Incredible people like yourself or myself that are teaching people these indigenous practices of realization, that they reconnect with their senses. What are your thoughts on that?
I agree wholeheartedly. Again, I think it comes back to a question of identity. The way that we identify ourselves influences our goals, values, and objectives in life. For example, if I think I'm an American man, that's how I behave. Or if I think I'm a Republican or a Democrat or this or that, it influences how I express myself, how I set my goals, values, and objectives. So for a long time, through their monopoly in the education system in most parts of the world, certain scientists and academics have been dictating a very materialistic sense of identity, that we're basically machines made of matter in competition with each other for survival. And if one accepts that kind of identification, one's goals and values become very materialistic. And we think that to produce and consume more material things is the main purpose of human existence. And in that process of producing and consuming more and more material things, wealth is generated, and it isn't distributed in a very equal way. It's concentrated in certain hands. And as a result of that, those who are able to control that flow of wealth are able to try to keep things arranged in such a way that that flow keeps going. And I mean, people have different ideas about who exactly is benefiting the most from the way things are currently set up. But the whole system rests on keeping people in that sense of identifying mostly as beings made of matter and desirous of material possessions and material prestige and things like that. And to keep that system intact, everything else has to be marginalized so that people reject it. I mean, even if one is religious, it can be materialistic. In other words, simply pray to God, help me become a good material producer and consumer. You get that aspect of things. Now, if there were a different sense of identity, if we're all beings of pure consciousness, we're not purely material beings, we would have a different set of goals, values, and objectives in life, and a different set of political, social, economic institutions to facilitate that way of life, which would be quite different than what we have today, which is meant to facilitate the opposite. So those of us on the consciousness side of things are kind of swimming against the flow, which makes it a little difficult. Now, it would be nice to live in a time when one's personal values and convictions and intuitions are shared by the elites of the society that one finds oneself in. But unfortunately, today, that's not the case. So it makes it a little more difficult, to have to go against the flow of the time that one's living in. But each individual has to make up their mind about these things, and I've made up my mind what I'm going to do.
Yeah. It brings me to your journey in discovering the origins of the human. I want to ask you, what are your thoughts on this construct or principles that people constantly relate to in relation to the laws of the universe? What through your own research and discovery, what value is that, and what sort of historical evidence leads us to these very principles, and where does it come from?
Well, throughout history, there have always been these two basic worldviews that have been replacing each other. At one period of time, one is dominant. At other periods of time, the other is dominant. And the two worldviews are the matter-based universe and the consciousness-based universe. So those who accept the matter-based view will try to explain consciousness as a product of matter, a temporary byproduct of matter. They would say, in this day and age, they tend to say, well, consciousness is a byproduct of bioelectrical activity in the brain. If you arrange matter in the form of neurons in a sufficiently complex way, the result will be consciousness, the way we experience it, but only temporarily. At the time of death, when the neurons in the brain begin to die, cease to function, there would be no more consciousness. So that's one worldview. The other worldview is a consciousness-based universe, where instead of consciousness being generated by matter, it's the opposite. In the beginning, there's consciousness, and matter, what we call matter, is generated by the original conscious aspect of things. And it's temporary. It only exists if you're in a certain state of consciousness where you think it's independent. Then, although it's ultimately spiritual and consciousness, for you, it behaves like matter. So those two basic worldviews have always been there, and they have different laws of nature associated with them. If you're on the material side, then you try to, a matter-based picture of reality, then everything is explained by physics, the science that deals with the operations of matter. If you're on the consciousness-based universe side of things, you look for these laws of consciousness and attraction and relationship and the different states of consciousness and awareness that it's possible to have and explore. So, yeah, there's a fundamental distinction. For me, the laws of physics operate on a certain subset of the total reality, not the complete reality. They don't explain, for example, consciousness. And even if you look at what physics has to say about matter, matter becomes extremely complex on the quantum level, that so much so that it starts to blend with consciousness. And ultimately, I would say, if they were able to follow it out to the root, they would find that matter is consciousness. Ultimately, it doesn't have any real existence. It's already moving in that direction. Many physicists are now turning to some version of panpsychism because they don't have any real explanation for how consciousness can come from matter. So they're saying matter on the particle level has as one of its properties consciousness. Now, I don't think that really solves the problem, because I'm conscious and I don't experience my consciousness as a swarm of particulate conscious awareness moments. I experience it as kind of a global perception of things that integrates all kinds of sensory inputs into a unified display of which I'm aware and conscious. But anyways, it's an interesting topic, laws of nature.
Well, yeah, I mean, that would bring us to something as fundamental as karma in of itself. So that's an interesting one from a perspective of a Taoist, as opposed to just generally, that would be you're subjecting yourself to a duality that in that form transmutes good and bad karma from that fundamental understanding. But, you come to a non-centric oneness, non-dualistic sort of like state where everything is everything. So then the karmic model would be subject to understanding there's something even greater, but most people will not go past that. It's like, that's the law. And I'm like, okay, I get it. How I see it is this. I mean, because people put Buddhism and Taoism in the same category, and they're fundamentally very different. From a Taoist perspective, Buddhism is a pile of dirt covered in diamonds, and they grab another dirt, they grab another diamond, they toss it off looking for more dirt, spending their incarnation exposing as much dirt as possible. Whereas a Taoist will look at life like a pile of diamonds covered in dirt, dust off some more dirt, and wow, here's another diamond. It's a good day to be me. And so, I mean, perception and validation of your truth and your awareness and what that means to you, I think is huge, because once we get out of body, astral projection, all that kind of good stuff, there's so many variables, but most people are holding their line on the near-death experience. And because there's a consensus and there's so many people saying that the construct of that near-death experience results in a soul contract, a soul, or this, or that, or something else. And I fundamentally agree that that is true. Not for everyone. That doesn't have to necessarily be the blueprint of all things. It's the experience that they're having. The experiencer, the explorer, is having that very moment. And there's other people out there that are experiencing the same thing. That's the validation. Yet I can take it from a Taoist perspective, and it's fundamentally quite different when you enter higher dimensions of consciousness beyond the 3D, the 4D, the 5D, and it will experience itself and lay itself out in a different way that perhaps other people are, confirming as being the way, the absolute way, the only way. What are your thoughts on that?
I like your emphasis in what you started with about karma, because according to the system of thought that I follow and my experience, there is something beyond karma. Karma means generating good karma, performing acts that result in good things happening for you. Then there's vikarma, which means performing negative acts that generate bad experiences from you. So you've got good karma, bad karma. But beyond that, there's a state called akarma, karma, without duality, where there's just action for the sake of action, not for a good result or a bad result. Because if you're generating karma, that means you're generating another body for yourself in a future life in which you have to experience that so-called good or bad result. And in that sense, that dualistic picture, it has to be transcended by coming to the level of selfless action, akarma. So I thought that was a good point. So that's what I was thinking about as you were speaking on that topic. As far as the distinction between Buddhist and Taoistic thought, to think about that, I'm not probably as familiar with all the details, the intricacies of the different schools of thought in Buddhism or in Taoism to really comment about it. I would just say that as far as the diamonds are concerned, a similar example is used among the teachers of the Bhakti Yoga tradition, that we all have our original love for God, who, when you're actually in a relationship with, a loving relationship with, you don't understand as God. But that's another whole thing. But we all have that love for God, which is like a diamond in our hearts, but it's covered with dirt. So you just have to remove the dirt and the diamond is there. It's not that you have to go out and find it. It's already there. It's just covered at the present moment. You just have to uncover it, wash it off. And technically there's a term for it, Chetodarpana Marjanam, means cleaning the dust off the mirror of the heart's consciousness. And that is one of the purposes of meditation, is to clear off the dust in the mirror of the heart so it'll reflect true image and not an obscure image through a glass darkly, as Christian brothers would say.
Yeah, no, I agree wholeheartedly. It's really powerful. What I love hearing from you is your mission that through your journeys, you're holding yourself to understanding that, you know, you're open to all routes or directions that will take you to the truth of the origins of all things, and especially, you know, where you are using yourself, the barometer, to realize what is discerning or what is affirming what material is out there. And I think that fundamentally using that from the beginning has got you to be able to explore this journey. And just from the things that you've shared today, it's mind blowing, the timeline that we're looking at now. Now, when you go deeper, did you go down the path of Egyptian history? What's the recorded oldest I don't know culture, race that started everything? Where did it come from? From what the historians are getting us to believe would be the baseline?
Yeah. Well, first, I'd like to comment on a couple of things that you just said uh, about my willingness to explore different approaches to what's actually true. I think one of the big obstacles in the world today to true human understanding is exclusive claims to truth. The idea that I have the truth, no one else has the truth. I don't accept that. And I think it's a big obstacle, you know, these kinds of things. I would say if someone has a path of knowledge or wisdom or practice that leads them to the understanding that we're all beings of pure consciousness and we're meant for existing in loving harmony with each other, then I'll accept that. It's like if you have gold, you could form gold into coins and you could stamp it with the symbols of different nations. But if it's really gold, it doesn't matter what symbol you've stamped on it. It's not American gold or Russian gold or Chinese gold. If it's gold, it's gold. So it's the same with truth about these ultimate questions. You could stamp it with, the symbol of a different so-called faith, Christianity, Islam, this, Hinduism, this, that, or the other. But if it really delivers experientially and in a practical way the kinds of things that we're talking about, I accept it. I don't claim to have a monopoly on truth. So I thought that was very important. Now, to get to your specific question about Egypt, I have looked into it a little bit. I'm not an Egyptologist, and I know there are researchers in alternative history that have focused very much on Egypt, like John Anthony West, Robert Bauval, Chris Dunn, others. And they point out, and I agree with them, that if you look at the Egyptian pharaoh list, they go back very far in time, at least 100,000 years or more. And the tendency among modern scholars is to say, well, the most recent part of the list is historically accurate. But when you get back to the early pharaohs who are said to have lived, thousands and thousands and thousands of years ago, their That's mythology, and that's not the fact. I don't agree with that position. There have been researchers like Robert Bauval who have looked at the arrangement of the pyramids on the Giza Plateau, how they're aligned to different celestial phenomena like the equinox, which is the place where certain constellations rise at the time of year called the equinox in the spring. They vary over time. And he pointed out that the pyramids are arranged to where the stars would have been over 11,000 years ago. And there have been other scientists who have looked at the Sphinx and its alignment and the signs that the enclosure around the Sphinx has been subjected to water erosion. And they've pointed out that the last time that there was sufficient rain in the Sahara Desert to allow that amount of water to be flowing to make the kinds of erosion channels they see around the Sphinx, that would have been over 11,000 years ago, which is thousands of years older than what the current dominant mainstream opinion is about the age of the pyramids, which is somewhere in the range of 6,000 or 7,000 years at most. So, yeah, there are people who have focused on that aspect of things. Also, it's not very easy to explain exactly how the pyramids were manifest or how many of the artifacts that have been found of ancient Egyptian culture were manufactured, such as stone vases that are almost paper thin. How did they make those? That is kind of a mystery. Or they have enclosures that are meant as a sarcophagus, and they have perfect 90-degree angles, which is very difficult to accomplish with crude stone tools. So there are a lot of mysteries about ancient Egyptian civilization, but that hasn't been the main focus of my research. So I can't.
No, I really appreciate your insight. Have you looked into Chinese culture at all?
Well, just to the extent that in my book, Human Devolution, I looked at the culture of China in terms of its cosmology. And I found that they had the similar elements in the cosmology that the 40 or 50 other cosmologies that I examined also display. They have a concept that this world of our experience is just part of the total reality, which is a multi-dimensional reality with different levels. They also have the idea that the actual self is different than the gross physical body. They also have the idea that we're part of a whole cosmic hierarchy of beings. Humans on the terrestrial level of reality are, as I said, part of a whole cosmic hierarchy of beings, at the top of which is a supreme being, a kind of founder source of everything. Once I was invited to speak at a conference on the history of science in Beijing. So when I was there for that, it was an International Congress for the History of Science. And I gave a talk about Beijing Man, which was a discovery that was made at a site, short distance from Beijing during the 1920s. And the research had been funded by the Rockefeller Foundation. So I made a presentation about that and what the Rockefeller Foundation was up to in funding that research. It was part of a whole research program that they had in which they were funding early research into genetics, early research into the expanding universe, early research into human origins, but it was all part of one program. And people like Dr. Weaver and others who were officials in the Rockefeller Foundation said that this varied research program involving biology, astronomy, archaeology, many other scientific disciplines, was meant to ultimately understand human nature to the extent that scientists would be able to establish what they called beneficial control over human behavior. And they were very open about it. This kind of thing is still going on, but maybe not so openly advertised. But in any case, when I was in Beijing, I went to the City of Heaven, the old part of Beijing where they had different monuments and things from more ancient days. They're still preserved there. And they have one place that's kind of like a model of the cosmos. And, it's like a circular platform with different levels that represent the different levels of the cosmos as understood by the Chinese. So I was very interested to see that. And I'm a vegetarian, so I was happy to be able to find a Buddhist vegetarian restaurant in Beijing where I could satisfy my hunger, or that type of hunger. There's also the intellectual and spiritual hunger that got satisfied to some extent. So I do know that in China, in terms of its intellectual development during the time of Westernization, they adopted the Western historical view, which depended upon saying that the traditional Chinese view, based on their emperor list, which go very, very far back in time, like the Egyptian pharaoh list and the Sumerian king list, they had to reject the historicity of that and kind of fit everything into the Western timeline. So I think there's a lot to explore in terms of the changing ways that historians in China have looked at their history. Because on one level, it's a history that connects with celestial realms of reality and goes very, very far back in time. But the modern version of it kind of truncates all of that. So I think there is a lot to explore there.
Oh yeah, I mean, I'd spent many decades focusing on my own cultivation within the three pyramids and Latsu teaching me on a much higher consciousness level. And then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, in the last year, they said, "We want you to look at the pyramids." And I'm like, okay. Last time I checked, that doesn't have anything to do with any sort of Taoist lineage or anything within the Chinese sort of like historical timelines. And they're like, absolutely it does. And I'm like, well, I'm not familiar with it. You haven't shared it with me before. And literally that moment, I dug deeper and poof, there are hundreds of pyramids in the landscape in China that have not been excavated or explored in any way, shape, or form, and have been left dormant for, I think, the last knowing acknowledgement of these pyramids was back in the 1940s, and someone claimed to have flown over China, and they exhibited or were aware of this white pyramid that looked like, crystal or diamond or something of that nature, and then poof, we've never been allowed to fly over the landscape of China ever again, or they can't find it. They can't find this pyramid per se. And so when I went deeper in that, most, if not all, the pyramids have had the tops lopped off of them. And then I went straight to Latsu and I asked him, well, what's the purpose of that? Well, for all intensive purposes, they use star-stepping magic where they lay grids down on top of the pyramids and then use the star-stepping magic to access the constellations and draw those energies down into the pyramid for other purposes. And people go, whoa, that makes sense to me. They light up when they hear it. They're like, holy moly. Because at that point, that was the highest point that a human could get to the celestials. And that was the point where they would imprint all their magic and do all their stuff to connect with the heaven realms. So it's like, you can't make this stuff up. I mean, it's wild. But again, the exploration of these pyramids have been absent in the timeline. Looking back to the 1940s, the last time anyone in human history witnessed it being recorded or anyone exploring it, we're not privy to that in the Western world that even has ever happened. And if so, I mean, what was the last real epiphany was terracotta warriors. I mean, you can't get any more profound than that. That was wild, And that was a massive mind blower. And I'm sure if we look deeper on that, that goes way beyond the timeline that they're confessing that they came from. So when people talk about the origins of humans coming from Africa, what's the validity of that? Or is that true? Or where does that keep us going? From what point do you start or end with that?
Well, as I said, I kind of have an expanded conception of the origin of humans. I think the human form is infinite in age because universes full of different planets with different human-like forms in them have constantly been manifested and non-manifested in vast cycles of time. And the human form has always been available for conscious cells to use to elevate their consciousness to its original state, which is beyond all the creations and destructions of universes on the material level of reality. So I would say is no origin of the human form. Now, it may be manifest in a particular universe on a particular planet in a particular time and place. That may be a fact. But as far as the existence of it, its origin can't be traced.
Wow.
I don't know if that makes sense, but
oh yeah, it absolutely makes sense to me.
But
Go ahead.
But if you believe we're a cosmic accident and in a we're accidental beings in an accidental universe, and that if you played the tape of evolution, it wouldn't result in the exact same series of genetic mutations and changing environmental conditions that would give you human beings again. In other words, if you accept the idea that we are just an accident of evolution, then you could say, well, according to our best understanding of our best scientists, according to our best theories and whatever evidence we've accumulated up to the present moment in the terms of fossil evidence and genetic evidence, we would say humans originated in Africa about 300,000 years ago. But if they were honest, accepting their assumptions, they would admit that's just a provisional conclusion based on the best evidence that we now have, but it could change radically in the future.
Yeah.
But I don't accept that whole series of assumptions. I think they're a feature of the current generation of scientists' understanding of what they assume to be a matter-based universe.
You were talking about the history of science. What was the first point of this new language that we perceive as, contemporary and a way to transmute an understanding that has been indigenous and internal for millions of years? What was the spark of this language, and how does it materialize in our world today?
Well, as I was mentioning earlier, these two basic languages or sets of understandings about a matter-based universe and a consciousness-based universe has always been operative. There's always been a situation in which they are in dialogue with each other or in conflict with each other, or one is dominant and the other is dominant. That's been going on forever. But in recent times, I think if we look at science in Europe about 500 or 600 years ago, we will see that scientists were investigating mystic powers. They were investigating a multidimensional cosmos. They were talking about all kinds of entities and beings and laws and forces that would now be considered totally outside the world of science. But around the end of that period, different scientific institutions were formed, like the Royal Institution in London, for example, and just agreed among themselves, look, let's put aside this, all these investigations into witchcraft and mystic powers and different dimensions of reality. Let's just focus on ordinary matter, the chemical elements, and let's get away from the other stuff. And that was very productive for them in this sense. They tremendous amount of knowledge of how ordinary matter operates that gave them a great deal of control over it. And using that knowledge and that experimental experience, they were able to develop technologies and pharmaceuticals and other products that were greatly valued by governments, corporations, and the people in general. For example, they were able to develop much better weapons. Of course, governments liked that very much, and they were willing to invest a lot of money in it, which was very good for the development of science. They also, as I said, developed pharmaceuticals and other products that were greatly valued by corporations involved in production of things and selling of things. And of course, governments liked all the tax revenues that were generated by that economic activity. And we, the people, liked the stuff that they were producing. So it was very productive for them in the sense that it increased their prestige and influence and access to resources in society. And it goes on today. And just like, the film Oppenheimer, that came out recently about how much resources the United States government put into developing an atomic bomb during World War II. And it goes on today. Science gets a tremendous amount of funding because of its ability to produce weapons of mass destruction that give nations advantages over each other in potential conflicts. So science and engineering get a lot of money and a lot of power and prestige because of their ability to deliver these things, even up to the present moment. So that's the result of certain decisions that were made. It was very productive, but it was at the expense of being able to come up with a complete scientific picture of reality. And because of that, society has suffered in a lot of ways. They haven't been able to explain the origin of life. There are about 40 or 50 different theories about how different chemicals may have combined together to form the first self-reproducing single-celled organism, but none of them are widely accepted. Neither do they have any explanation for consciousness. It's a big problem in the world of science that they don't know who to give money to because there are so many different theories about how consciousness came about. So, and because of that lack of understanding of that side of things, there are intense levels of conflict in the world today, and there is environmental destruction. We have an unsustainable economy, and this is causing severe problems. And I think that's all a result of certain decisions that were made in the world of science that are ongoing today and are a continuing source of weapons of mass destruction, environmentally destructive technologies, and the division of human society into competing groups. And the competition could result in nuclear war, something that's being talked about today as more probable than at any time since World War II, when weapons of mass destruction like that were first used by our country. There's the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, which puts out every year what they call the Doomsday Clock. This organization was set up by Robert Oppenheimer, Albert Einstein, and other atomic scientists after World War II. and they started this atomic doomsday clock, and they set it at 20 minutes to midnight. Now, in 2024, they've recently set it at 90 seconds to midnight, which means we're closer to nuclear catastrophe than we've ever been. And, and as I said, these are results of the kind of science that and scientific language that has been common over the past several centuries. But there's always been a minority of scientists that are trying to push things in another direction. And I think there is some progress in that regard. But we'll have to see how far it can go.
Well, I mean, it's literally like we just spoke on it not so long ago about Darwin's theory. We're literally living it out right now. It's literally upon us, and it's a construct. I mean, just the time clock of atomic catastrophe in itself, a pondering, evident result of the ending of all things. Just having that in the background creates a construct within the consumer of this information to resonate with that and start to perceive things with that in the background. And of course, that creates an energy, a vibration, a frequency, and people resonate there. And then it becomes the probability of it becomes more and more likely because they're setting this sort of state of awareness, and it's like a front-loading pre-programming from a conscious and unconscious process. So it's, in my opinion, another form of manipulation to create an end result that they're looking for. Would it be created without these, subtle pushes in all directions, forming the individual's experience and perception of what reality is? I don't believe so. If we're, humans are so horrible. They're the way that they are able to do these types of things with callous and removed from emotion. You and I are talking about embodying ourselves as one, as pure love, but then we have this ability that people like to call free will, where you have a choice. You want to go with the dukkha, as my dear friend would say, the distortion. You can go with the distortion, and with that brings upon, this idea that we're actually counting down a clock to inevitable destruction of the human race and the world as we know it by a dictator. And I'm not so sure what the catalyst of these particular people's ideas or reasoning behind creating a clock in the first place, but it sets forth the programming, the unconscious programming that other people start to believe in. I don't know. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, that's an interesting question, because it brings up, I would just ask you, is what you're saying an indication that there will never be use of atomic weapons? It's just I don't know what the exact word is, psyop kind of operation to keep people in a certain mentality where they can be manipulated, and that there's no intention among any of the powers that are in possession of atomic and thermonuclear weapons to ever use them.
Yeah, I believe, I wholeheartedly believe that it's a manipulation like anything within a system. As we have a governing body that sort of regulates this 3D reality, we have put in forth, we the people, a structured government that applies to many things. And these government programs that come in 3-letter words are completely generated and controlled by fear. And they don't have enough resources to possibly contain or control 400 million people in this country alone. So they use fear as a catalyst to control the very action and nature of individuals. Now, this would then ponder the idea of survival of the fittest, because if there wasn't any sort of regulated sort of construct of what we call an idea of law and order, the weakest would be consumed, just like the weakest puppy would be left not to drink the mother's milk. It would just die in the corner of the room. So, people would go, well, see, this is why we have this. This is how we believe. This is what we believe in. But, I can then ponder the idea of a little commune in California, and I spoke to a spiritual Christ consciousness devoted disciple of Yodelinga. I think it's Yodelinga. I can't pronounce his name. Yodelinga. I think he's a yogi, and he had created a community back in the 50s that was given to him by his teacher, Bobby Yeager or something like this. And he came over and preached these incredible ideas of, oneness and spirituality. And there's communities all over the world now of people that are like-minded, that want to stay in this Christ consciousness, as we would refer to it as love, this oneness, and they're living in this incredible, infrastructure, enjoying that very, understanding. Now, is that being subject to the outside frameworks of what we perceive as reality? Not so much, because when you start understanding how manifestation really works and you're able to resonate with it, and it's evidence-based, so it means nothing until you can actually apply it and create a manifestation and it's tangible. And, oh my goodness, I thought of someone and they called me, or I asked someone to move out of the way in my mind and the car moved in front of me. These are all evidence-based experiences. And of course, you can expand on those and create something greater if you choose to. And it all has to do with resonance. And so, this whole survival of the fittest construct that we're literally living in, and with this time clock of imminent destruction, is an absolute manipulation. And I still believe in love. I still know it to be true. I know it to be the oneness that people will blindly, in blind faith, embody when they experience it. So then it comes back to, well, do you believe in a duality? Well, in this duality, I believe that love will prevail over all, and that this manipulation of the idea that the imminent destruction of mankind is just part of the cyclical cycle of the human, as in, here's the timeline of history, which then you and I go back to, well, we can have a conversation with many people what you believe the timeline of history is, and the cycle of spirituality, atheism, religion, and we go back around again, an offering of manipulation that then, if you accept it, then you become subject to it, is also part of a bigger picture of how you perceive all things. And so the more people like yourself and myself that can help raise the conscious collective, I believe that it's all powerful. I've throughout 30 years, I've witnessed physical healings beyond someone's wildest imagination. And that came from me believing in something greater. So in answer to that, no, I don't believe that's ever going to materialize.
Yeah. Well, what I think is, I agree that the prospect of use of these weapons is being used to manipulate consciousness on a big scale. I do accept that. And I also accept the idea that ultimately the spiritual side of things, the love, is going to triumph or be dominant. Sometimes I speak against what I call cosmic paranoia in connection with extraterrestrials and UFOs and things like that. Sometimes people present very dark visions of our fate in the universe in confronting such forces. So I've always been an advocate of not surrendering to what I call, as I said, cosmic paranoia, which is another manipulative thing. But I'm not quite certain about the idea that these weapons would never be used. I think there's a lot of reasons why those who are in control of such things would not want to use them. I think that's a fact. They haven't used them, but they have been used in warfare. So we have at least that experience that it is possible that these weapons could be used. They have been used in warfare. So I'm not sure that at the present moment I accept that they won't ever be used, but it's an idea I'm willing to consider. But without doubt, something I absolutely agree with, the threat of using them has been used to manipulate populations to act in certain ways.
Yeah. I mean, that's just the threat of it all. That's how humans have realized that, sentient beings like, a dog, a cat, they're thinking present moment. We have this incredible ability to think in the past, present, or future and have ideas and frame them and create them around certain things and process things and sit with them and attempt to understand them. And with that, I think is the very downfall of, the intellect from a humanistic perspective, as opposed to just embodying just the spirituality. And that's why, it excites me when you tell me back, 600 years ago, when people were processing the idea that all this mystical, magical, spiritual stuff was part of science. And then it was, oh, no, that would empower people too much. We need to go to something simplistic that we can sort of hammer and nail type of thing. And, it works and we don't have to go there. So over generations of hundreds of years, we've lost sight of this powerful source energy that we have access to. And that's why Eastern philosophies or practices that you and I gravitate to still embody spirituality and the idea of something greater than this, physicality. And, I think it's definitely dying a slow death through, controlling bodies of these very countries across the world. The idea of faith. And I would like to say, I hope someone believes in something. I don't care what it is, whether it's Christianity, Catholicism, Hindu, Buddha, God, a universe. Believe in something. Believe in yourself. That's the first realization of being empowered. And you start there and you sort of craft your reality around experience-based moments that validate what is true to you. But, we're being basically filtered and dampened. And even Tom Campbell, who's a physicist, a NASA physicist, will say that none of these physicists have a clue of what's going on. And, they don't have any idea. They want everything to have an answer that's in a box that is crunched by numbers, and that's the only solution. Yet it's so much greater than that, from, realizing that consciousness can't be measured, intention can't be measured, but both of them are very valid. And you can have experiential moments to validate them on an individual level. And then, of course, the classic one that quantum physicists will get stumped on is gravity. There you go. Oh no, there goes that theory. So they can't measure that. So all of a sudden they're a little stumped and perplexed that it doesn't still all add up. Yet they want to, subscribe to the notion that their theory is absolute. Their truth is the only truth. So if you have someone who has a different theory, because that's why they call them theories, they're not absolutes. There's no peer-reviewed data to validate this as the ultimate truth to all things. Yet their theory is more valid than, say, perhaps yours or mine, that we're going by an intuitive understanding of things and then experiencing things and then validating it through our own discovery of information. And I say tomato, you say tomato, and it can all be realized. Yet people truly just dismiss you on the fact that, no, that's not my truth, and so your truth is incorrect, which is so, limiting. It's problematic. And I think it's not a great way to start a conversation, in my opinion.
Yeah. Going back to something you said at the beginning of your current remarks, I do accept the idea that there are positive things that people who are moving in our direction can do in terms of establishing communities and things like that, that aren't simply reactions to manipulative strategies that are being pushed through mainstream society by the controlling powers and influencers. I mean, I think that's definitely true. Like, my guru asked for intentional communities based on spiritual principles to be established around the world, and several have been established, and I've been to several of them. So I think you're right about that there's a positive impulse that can be given by people on the consciousness-based side of things that is not simply just a reaction to whatever negative programs are being promoted or influenced by the powers that be in society in general. I think that's definitely a fact. And it is also a fact that one of the big outstanding problems in the standard model of quantum mechanics is they haven't been able to integrate gravity into it. That is, I agree, a big outstanding problem, along with their inability to explain consciousness, their inability to explain the origin of life. They're also having a hard time with the origin of the universe. So, total agreement on that point.
Yeah. My goodness, we have covered a large space of information, my friend. I'm very grateful. I feel like potentially you've discovered things or spoke on things that potentially you haven't shared before on a podcast, and I feel very grateful that you've gone so much deeper on that.
Yeah, it's something I appreciate in a host of a podcast. If I get asked a question I haven't heard 100 times before and don't have a prepackaged little speech to give and reply to it, that I have to think a little bit about it. So I give you that.
Yeah, I think it's been absolutely fascinating and exciting with the potential of all the things that we've spoken on today. I would like to sort of leave us here, and with the potential of inviting you back at some point in the future, and we could go over more information and other things. I would love that. So I'm just going to put that out there right now. I was very grateful that you shared your time with me today.
Yeah, well, I think you've been in touch with my publicist, media manager, Lori. So stay in touch with her about it, and we'll talk again, hopefully.
I would love that, my friend. I'm very grateful for you and all your exploration and revealing so many things that are, have to be absorbed and realized when you start digging deeper, just the way you
I
did.
think you're right that it was a wide-ranging conversation, but I think it has to be because there are so many elements. I mean, it's not just one thing that I disagree with. How long humans have been present on Earth. That leads to many other questions. And I think what we're talking about is a fundamental renegotiation of our whole picture of reality, which involves so many aspects. So I think a conversation like that, it could be narrowly focused on a particular aspect, but really it has to involve a lot of things.
And I believe we really had a great expanding exploration of that for the audience to get a deeper, grasp of all these things that are going on. And I think that's really, I would say in closing today, I'll ask you one question. What is your definition of consciousness?
Consciousness is a symptom of the soul. The soul is consciousness, and it has consciousness.
Wow.
That's a non-dualistic explanation.
Yeah. I'm resonating with that, my friend. That's all things. So I want to thank you, Michael, for sharing your time with us today. I'm very grateful that you came on the podcast, and it's mind-blowing. I've been looking forward to this for quite some time, and I really appreciate the shared conversation.
Well, I'll just mention that if people are interested in pursuing any of my work, writings, and things like that, I just encourage them to visit my website, mcremo.com, mcremo.com. And we were talking about a wide variety of subjects. We have a special offer now for 5 of my principal books dealing with all of these topics for $100. That's a special offer that I'm extending to the listeners of this show, or viewers also. So have a look at the website for that.
Oh, absolutely. I always put all the information where you can get in touch with the guest. And you beat me to it. I was going to ask you, what are you offering the audience today? And you got right to it. So I would applaud and suggest the audience go and check out Michael's stuff, and all his social will be under this podcast. And this will go on YouTube, and then it will go across all 20 platforms. So that's a whole nother discovery level where, I get shocked every day the amount of thousands of downloads that I get, and people download conversations just like this, because most of mine are at least 2 or 3 hours, and people love it. They absolutely love it. It's just where we are today with information. And when you have a brilliant mind like yourself being able to share this insight, people absorb it and they want to know more. So I want to thank you, Michael.
Yeah, thank you for hosting such a wonderful podcast.
I'm very, very grateful, my friend. And I'll thank you. And I want to thank the universe for bringing you into my life. And then I want to thank the audience for sharing their time with us today. And I am your humble servant and Sifu, Taoist Master Sun Qing. And I'll see you on the next one, guys.